You think you know your family until money enters the room. Ava had always been the quiet one, the simple bookstore clerk who chose love, loyalty, and Sunday dinners with her grandparents over status and wealth. But when those grandparents passed away and left her $18 million inheritance, her entire family changed overnight. The grieving relatives became predators. The fake tears disappeared. The accusations began. And at the reading of the will, one shocking decision exposed years of jealousy, entitlement, and betrayal. What Ava did know was that her grandparents had left behind more than money, they left proof.
My name is Ava. I am 27. Just 6 weeks ago, I worked at a bookstore, living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. My grandparents basically raised me, not my parents. They were wealthy but lived humbly, teaching me that character mattered more than money. After they died in a horrible accident, my whole world collapsed. Then, at the lawyer's office, I found out they left me everything, their entire $18 million estate. Suddenly, family who never even called them wanted a piece of it. But I refused to give in. If you want to see how money exposes who people really are, stick with me. And tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about how family jealousy can turn toxic. Growing up, my parents were physically present, but that's about it. My father, Marcus, was a workaholic, always chasing another promotion, pulling 60-hour weeks. My mother, Evelyn, cared more about her social events and charity parties. We almost never had dinner together, and if we did, they're on their phones with work calls or party planners. They gave me shelter and food, but not much love. From the age of 5, I spent every single weekend and summer with my grandparents, Eleanor and Richard. Their simple 4-bedroom house was my sanctuary. Despite being incredibly wealthy, their life was modest. On their 3 acres of land, Grandpa Richard taught me to grow peppers and corn in his garden. Grandma Eleanor showed me how to bake my own bread and mend my clothes. They showed up for every school plays and spelling bee my parents conveniently forgot. My grandparents built their fortune from nothing. They started a small manufacturing business in their garage back in the 70s with one machine and pure grit. By the time I was born, Peterson Manufacturing was a regional powerhouse with 2 large factories. But you would never guess their net worth just by looking at them. For 20 years, my grandpa drove the same old Ford pickup. My grandma used coupons at the supermarket and only bought clothes from the sales rack. They always told me, money is a tool, Ava, not a trophy. Use it to build something meaningful, not to show off for people you don't even like. That way of thinking created a huge rift between them and my father. As their only child, he thought he would inherit everything and live like a prince. He hated their simple lifestyle, calling them cheap and old-fashioned. What he called deprivation, they called building character. They paid for his college, but they still insisted he get a summer job. After he graduated, they helped him with the down payment on a small starter home, not the glamorous downtown condo he wanted. The real breaking point was when father demanded to be made a vice president at their company, despite having no experience. My grandparents said no, telling him he had to earn it like everyone else. He quit in a fit of rage, took a job in banking, and their relationship was permanently fractured. With me, they were the complete opposite. They paid for all of my schooling, so I graduated without any student loans. They just encouraged me to find a job I was passionate about, not one that was just for the money. So when I chose to be a bookstore clerk, they were incredibly proud of me, even though my starting salary was barely enough to live on. All through my 20s, I was extremely close with my grandparents. We had dinner together every Sunday, without fail. I was their personal tech support, setting up their tablets and teaching them how to use FaceTime. They taught me all their family recipes and told me stories about their youth. During the holidays, I always chose to be with them instead of my parents, which caused massive arguments with my mother. She saw it as a personal rejection. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment about a 20-minute drive from my grandparents' house. It was small, but it was mine, filled with furniture from thrift stores and lots of plants. My salary from the bookstore wasn't great, but it was enough to get by. I found happiness in simple things, like checking out books from the library, hiking trails in the state park, and helping out at the local animal shelter. My grandparents respected my independent life, though they'd sometimes gift me practical things, like a new set of tires or a high-quality coffee maker. 6 weeks ago, my whole world came crashing down. I was at home on a Tuesday night when the phone rang. It was the state troopers. My grandparents were driving home from dinner when a drunk driver ran a stop sign, T-boning their car. They were killed on impact. The officer said they didn't suffer, but that was little comfort. The funeral was a total haze. I remember my parents taking over everything, bickering with the funeral director about every little expense. My brother Leo flew in from out of state, but was glued to his phone the entire time. My Aunt Chloe put on a theatrical performance, sobbing whenever people were watching, but her tears vanished the moment they looked away. Uncle David just lingered in the background. His wife's silent shed. None of them had visited my grandparents in years. But there they were, playing the part of the devoted, grieving family. I just felt empty. The only two people who ever truly loved me were gone. Their house, once so full of joy and laughter, felt cold and hollow. I couldn't bring myself to go inside after the funeral. I just went back to my apartment, took a leave from my job, and tried to absorb the shock. 2 weeks after the service, I received a call from Mr. Harrison, my grandparents' attorney. He informed me that I needed to come to his office with my parents, aunt, and uncle for the reading of the will. I had no idea that meeting was about to reveal my family's true colors. The morning of the reading, it was cold and raining, which perfectly matched my mood. I arrived at the law office 15 minutes early in a simple black dress, holding the umbrella my grandma insisted I keep in my car. The office was located in a beautiful old Victorian house that had been converted, filled with dark wood paneling and leather furniture. Mr. Harrison greeted me with a kind, firm handshake. He was in his 60s, with gentle eyes and graying hair. My grandparents had always said he was more than just a lawyer. He was a dear friend they'd known for 30 years. "I am so deeply sorry for your loss, Ava," he said softly. "Eleanor and Richard were truly wonderful people. I'll miss our card games and her famous apple pie during our appointments." His sincere sympathy made my eyes well up with tears. "Thank you," I managed to say. "They always spoke so fondly of you." At that moment, the heavy glass door swung open, and my family arrived like a tidal wave. My father, Marcus, charged in first, scowling at his luxury watch. At 56, he looked like a colder, harsher copy of my grandpa, completely lacking his warmth. My mother, Evelyn, glided in after him, holding a designer purse that likely cost more than my entire car. My 25-year-old brother, Lilo, followed, wearing sunglasses indoors like some wannabe movie star. His idea of formal wear was a wrinkled shirt, sloppily tucked into his jeans. Aunt Chloe, my dad's sister, trailed behind them, already complaining loudly into her phone about some issue at her country club. Uncle David crept in last. He offered me a quick, anxious nod before fixing his on the floor. They had been married for 2 decades, but I doubt I'd ever heard him speak more than a handful of words. "All right, let's get this show on the road," my father barked, not even bothering with a hello. "Some of us have actual companies to run, mister." Harrison offered a strained smile. "Of course, Marcus. If everyone would please follow me into the conference room." The air in that room felt heavy with greed as we all sat around a massive polished table. My father immediately claimed the chair at the head of the table, like a king holding court. I sat near Mr. Harrison, as far away from my father as possible. Everyone else fell into their usual places. My mother sat at my father's side with Leo's next to her, and Aunt Chloe and Uncle David sat directly across from them. Before we get started, Mr. Harrison began, I want to state for the official record that Eleanor and Richard were of perfectly sound mind when they last updated this will 1 year ago. They were incredibly deliberate and clear about their intentions. My father just scoffed. Just get on with it, Harrison. We all know how this is supposed to work. My father built that company. I'm his son. It's just a formality, Mr. Harrison ignored his comment and opened a thick file. He put on his reading glasses and started. I, Richard Peterson, and I, Eleanor Peterson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be our last will and testament. The dry legal language droned on for several minutes as Mr. Harrison went through the standard clauses and executor appointments. My family was practically buzzing with impatience. At last he arrived at the part they were all there for. We hereby bequeath our entire estate, which includes but is not limited to all cash accounts totaling roughly $5 million. Our investment portfolio valued at $9 million. All real estate holdings, including our main residence, valued at $3 million, and our 10% ownership stake in Peterson Manufacturing, worth an estimated $1 million to our cherished granddaughter, Ava Rose Miller. The entire room went deathly still. I just stared, my heart pounding in my ears, certain eyes hallucinating. Ethan's lawyer went on. The agreement makes specific provisions for our child with Sophie Dubois, and therefore no provisions for the current marital estate with my wife, Maya, or our unborn child. My financial support during our marriage has been more than sufficient, a fact my legal team is well prepared to defend. My father-in-law, Arthur, shot to his feet, nearly tipping his wingback chair over. Give me that, he roared, snatching the iPad from the lawyer's hands to read the settlement terms. This is insane, my mother-in-law, Eleanor scoffed. $50 million to a venture capitalist. I'll burn through it in a year. My brother-in-law, Leo, slammed his glass on the marble table. What about my funding? I'm part of this family too. I need that seed money for my crypto platform. His wife, Jessica, shot me a venomous look. What did you do to him? How did you drive him to this? I was just frozen, completely numb, as the words echoed in the massive room. $50 million. My husband was not just leaving me. He was giving our future to another woman. The lawyer calmly retrieved the iPad from Arthur. If everyone could please remain calm. There is more. Ethan recorded a message to explain everything. He tapped the screen and the massive home theater screen on the wall came to life. Ethan appeared, sitting in his glass-walled office, overlooking the bay. My stomach twisted seeing him there, looking exactly as he had this morning when he left for a board meeting. His recorded self spoke first. If you are watching this, it means the papers have been served. I wanted to explain my choice myself to prevent any confusion. He stared directly into the camera. Maya, I still love you, but our worlds have become incompatible. For years, SS voice filled the room. I've watched you focus on your local gardening projects while my company was changing the world. You've treated my life as work like a personal bank, a way to fund your little hobbies, not a dynasty for us to build together. He listed every charity auction I'd missed, every tech conference I'd skipped, painting my anxiety as total disinterest. The company I built, Ethan said, was never just about a comfortable life. It says about creating a legacy, about making a permanent mark on the future. I did it with absolute focus and sacrifice. He paused for a moment. Sophie is the only person who truly shares that drive. She pushes me. She understands the cost of ambition. She isn't satisfied with a quiet, simple existence, he continued. She flies to our international offices to help strategize, not just to shop. Her entire career is built on scaling companies like mine. I trust Sophie to be a true partner in this empire. She will use his resources to build our vision, not just to live off them. The video continued for several more minutes, with Ethan detailing his massive sense with Sophie global initiatives, joint philanthropic ventures, their whole future mapped out. As the screen went black, my father-in-law was livid. This is complete nonsense. She has obviously brainwashed him. We are fighting this settlement tooth and nail. Ethan's lawyer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. He anticipated that reaction, Arthur. Ethan completed a full psychological workup before filing, with 2 independent psychiatrists confirming he is of sound mind. Moreover, he has kept meticulous journals for years, documenting the growing divide between his and Maya's goals. I have to advise you all that challenging this divorce on these grounds will be incredibly costly, prolonged, and will almost certainly hurt the company's stock price. My mother-in-law turned to me, her voice slick with false concern. Maya, darling, this isn't T what he truly wants. He's just having a crisis. That settlement money needs to stay in the family trust to protect the business. You sign it over, of course, won't you? The air felt thin, like I couldn't breathe. All of them were staring at me. I need to think, I finally managed to say. I had no idea. Leo scoffed. What is there to think about? That capital needs to be managed by someone with actual market experience, he said, gesturing to himself. As they all began talking over each other, the lawyer quietly touched my arm. You don't have to decide anything right now, Naya. Take all the time you need. He passed me a heavy leather-bound portfolio. This has the complete offer, keys to a secure penthouse apartment, and contact information for your own legal and financial teams. Please, call me if you have any questions at all. The room quickly descended into a shouting match, with threats of countersuits and bitter accusations filling the air. Eventually, the lawyer had to insist that everyone leave. As we were walking toward the door, Ethan's father gripped my arm. This is not over, he hissed. You will be at our home for dinner tonight, 8 o'clock sharp. It was a command, not a request. I just nodded, too stunned to do anything else. As they all climbed into their identical black Rivians, I sat in my 10-year-old Prius in the visitor's parking lot, holding the portfolio. A life we had supposedly built together was just liquidated and aimed directly at my heart. I spent the afternoon in a daze, driving up the coast highway with no destination, finally stopping at a cliffside overlook to just try and breathe. The portfolio sat on the passenger seat, a time bomb I couldn't bring myself to open. Part of me was desperate to know the price he did put on us. The other part was terrified of the war it represented. At 7:50, I drove through the towering gates of my in-laws' Atherton estate, noticing the other cars were already there. Their 20,000-square-foot mansion rose up before me, a fortress of cold steel and glass meant to intimidate, not to welcome. I took a deep, shaky breath, grabbed the portfolio, and walked inside. They were all assembled in the grand living room, a space so perfectly arranged it felt more like a modern art gallery. My father-in-law stood by a massive stone fireplace, swirling a glass of scotch. My mother-in-law was posed on a white leather sofa. Leo was pacing furiously, barking into his phone, while his wife Jessica just stared at the polished concrete floor. Finally, Arthur spoke as I walked in. Maya, sit down. I took a seat in the armchair farthest away, needing to feel like I had an escape route. Let's handle this like adults, he began, his voice the same one he used to command boardrooms. Ethan has clearly had some sort of mental break. He would have wanted the family's assets to be protected, not squandered. My mother-in-law nodded in agreement. Dearest, a sum like this is incredibly complex. You're pregnant, you're far too emotional. Arthur has the experience to manage this fund correctly. You'll be looked after, naturally. We can find you a lovely condo, something more manageable for you. The insult was subtle but sharp. I refused to let it land. My silence seemed to fuel his confidence. This is our proposal. You will sign the full settlement over to a trust, which I, as the family patriarch, will manage. This ensures everyone's long-term interests are served. You will receive an annual stipend of 5%, which is quite generous for your simple lifestyle. 5%. My voice was barely a whisper. That S still $2.5 million. Exactly, Leo snapped, finally ending his phone call. More than enough for a gardener. I need at least 10 million for my new Web3 project. It's a guaranteed winner. I stared at him. Leo had burned through a dozen guaranteed winners, never holding a job longer than a few months. His last venture, a blockchain for artisanal coffee, cost his parents over $1 million before it collapsed. And the penthouse on Russian Hill should go to us, Jessica added. We have 2 children to consider. They need to be in the proper social environment for their schooling. I nearly burst out laughing. Jessica had never visited our penthouse without complaining about the downtown traffic. Her children, my niece and nephew, were practically strangers who sent us generic holidays cards that were clearly signed by an assistant. As the evening dragged on, their tactics shifted. When the business approach failed, they turned to guilt. After everything we have done for you, my mother-in-law started, her eyes getting misty. We brought you into our world, gave you a real position in society. Is this how you repay us? I almost gagged. Repay them? When had any of them ever asked me a single question about my work, my passions, or my life? My father-in-law's voice turned hard as steel. We are not asking you, Maya. We are informing you of what is going to happen. Either you sign these papers voluntarily, or we will contest the prenuptial agreement. We will expose every argument you and Ethan ever had. How many investor trips did you refuse to join? What did you tell your friends about our family? It is going to get incredibly ugly for you very quickly. The threat was crystal clear. I felt a wave of nausea, but then deep inside me something clicked. I remembered what my own dad told me when a developer tried to bully him off his land. Never let a rich man's bluster make you feel small, Maya, he said. Just know your ground and stand on it. Ethan's uncle David, who'd been silent all night, finally spoke. Arthur, perhaps we should slow down and give Maya a chance to breathe. My father-in-law shot him a look that could freeze fire. This doesn't concern you, David. It's immediate family business. I am his family, he said softly, but fell silent under Arthur's withering glare. By 9 o'clock, Leo was already on his laptop, drafting the wire transfer documents. My mother-in-law was on the phone with their family lawyer, perfecting the legal language. Jessica was already browsing real estate listings for our penthouse, discussing which walls she would demolish first. They were carving up my life before I'd even had a chance to speak. No one mentioned what Grandma and Grandpa wanted, not once. They never asked me how I should manage their properties. At 10:30, my dad printed a document and slid it across the dining room table with a pen. Sign it, he said. I read it over. The language was vague, essentially signing away my control over everything my grandparents built. In exchange, I'd get an allowance that my father would decide on later. I set the document down and took a breath. The room fell silent. What did you say? My dad asked, his voice low and dangerous. I said, no, I will not sign this or anything else. My grandparents trusted me with their legacy, and I plan to honor that trust. My mom just erupted, screaming about how ungrateful I was being. My brother Jason threw insults at me I wouldn't ever repeat. My aunt started crying, talking about her kid's future. But I just sat there, my face like stone, letting the word no protect me. Finally, my dad slammed his glass on the table so hard it cracked. Enough, he roared. I told your grandfather you were too naive. You manipulated them then, and you're manipulating us now with this innocent act. He got right in my face, his finger pointed at my nose. You have a choice to make, Ava. Right now. You either sign that paper and you remain part of this family, or you walk away with your precious inheritance and you're disowned. You can't have both. The threat just hung there in the heavy silence. I looked around at each of them, desperately searching for one shred of kindness, of real family. There was none. And that S when it hit me. I was never really family to them. I was just a key to a vault. That's all I ever was. I'm not signing, I said as I stood up. I'm sorry you feel this way, but I have to do what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. Then get out of my house, my father hissed. Pack a bag and be gone by midnight. You're not welcome here. I have my own apartment, I reminded him. I haven't lived here for years. He just laughed a cold, hollow sound. The apartment we co-signed for because your little art gallery barely pays the rent. Check your lease, Ava. One of my shell companies owns that building. Your tenancy is terminated. My stomach lurched. He was right. I couldn't get approved by myself, so they had helped. I had no clue they owned the building. You have 30 minutes to get what you need, my mom said, glancing at her designer watch. We're changing the locks in the morning. I just stood there, completely numb. They were really making me homeless over money they had no right to. Clock's ticking, Jason sneered. Better start moving. Those millions won't find you a bed tonight. Packing my life into a few bags was a blur. I was on autopilot, grabbing clothes, documents, anything I could reach. How did money do this to people? Turn them into these monsters? My dad stood in my old bedroom doorway with his arms crossed, watching me like a warden. As I packed, I heard my mother on the phone downstairs with a real estate agent, already planning to sell my grandparents' house. You were never truly one of us anyway, my dad said, his voice flat and empty. Your mother and I were getting a divorce, but then she found out she was pregnant with you. You were the only reason we even stayed together. The words were so casual, so cruel. It felt like punch to the stomach. I always felt like an outsider, but hearing him say it, then my mother appeared. We've wasted enough on you, she added. Private college, that summer in Europe, all those art supplies you wasted. Consider our investment a total loss, she said. An investment. Not a daughter, just a bad business deal. Then Jason showed up, leaning in the doorway, smirking. You're gonna regret this when you're all alone, he said. That inheritance will run out, you know. And when you come crawling back to us, we will remember this. How you chose money over your own family. I zipped my last bag, blinking away the tears. I refused to let them see me cry. Is that all? My dad barked. I looked around the bedroom I grew up in. I'd only stayed here on holidays since I moved out, but it was still my room. My high school awards, my college diploma, all my books, the photo albums, my entire history. I can get the rest later, I mumbled. My father just laughed. There is no later. Whatever you don't take with you tonight gets thrown in a dumpster. Your choice. The coldness of it was shocking. They were erasing me from their history, all because I wouldn't give them a fortune they hadn't earned. I grabbed my grandma's handmade quilt from the bed and stuffed it into a bag. I wasn't leaving that. With bags slung over my shoulders, I walked downstairs. Nobody offered to help me. At the front door, I took one last look back. They were all standing in the foyer like a firing squad, their faces a mixture of fury and smug satisfaction. You have the money now, my mom said, but you'll learn that family is priceless. You'll regret what you threw away. I'm not the one throwing family away, I said softly. You are. Then I walked out into the dark. The door slammed behind me, sealing my fate. Leaning against my car, it all finally hit me. I was homeless. My entire family had just disowned me. In one night, I'd become a millionaire and an orphan. Sitting in my car, I finally broke. The tears just flooded out, these huge painful sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for my grandma and grandpa, missing their warmth more than ever. I cried for the family I always yearned for but never actually had. And I cried for myself, completely alone in a world that had just been shattered. It felt like hours went by, but it was probably just minutes. I wiped my face and started the car. But where could I even go? I couldn't afford a hotel room, and calling a friend this late to explain this disaster felt impossible. Then I remembered the envelope the lawyer gave me. Inside was a set keys with a little brass owl keychain my grandpa always carried. They were the keys to my grandparents' house, a house that, it dawned on me, was now mine. The drive across town took about 20 minutes. Every turn brought this strange mix of relief and dread going home, but to a home where they were no longer waiting. I hadn't gone back since the funeral. I just couldn't. The porch light was on, probably on a timer my grandpa set. I sat in the car for a long time before grabbing a bag and walking to the door, key shaking in my hand. The house smelled exactly the same, like my grandma's rose potpourri and the wood polish my grandpa used on Sundays. I flicked on the lights, almost expecting to hear them call out from the kitchen. But the silence was absolute. I went to the guest room, which was always my room, and dropped my bag on the bed. It was untouched, just as I'd left it a month before the accident. The book I'd been reading was still on the nightstand, my bookmark holding the page. My grandma had left fresh towels out for me, ready for my next visit. That simple kindness, that hope for a future that never came, just shattered what was left of my heart. I collapsed on the bed and cried myself to sleep, still fully dressed. The morning sun was painfully bright. For a split second, I expected to smell coffee and hear my grandpa whistling off-key in the kitchen. Then the silence came crashing back. They were gone, and I had inherited their fortune and their enemies, who just happened to be my own family. My phone had exploded overnight with messages from my parents. They swung wildly between threats and fake attempts to smooth things over. "We can fix this, Ava, if you would just be reasonable." First, a text from my mother, but Dad was much more direct. "You have 24 hours before we file a lawsuit to contest the will." Jason S. text just gloated. "Enjoy the big empty house, but not for long." That last one sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like a real threat. I forwarded it to Matthew, my lawyer, who replied instantly, "Stay put. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't let anyone inside." His urgent tone was scary but also comforting. At least someone was in my corner. Matthew arrived right on time, holding a briefcase and 2 large coffees. I showed him to the kitchen, and we sat at the ex-old breakfast table my grandparents loved. "Okay, first thing," he said, sliding a coffee toward me. "Your family has already been in touch with 3 different law firms about challenging the will. I saw this coming, and I'm ready for it." I warmed my hands on the cup. "They evicted me from my apartment last night. Turns out my dad owns the building." Matthew just nodded. Classic Richard. Using power to get his way, he said, pulling papers from his briefcase. "What he doesn't know is your grandparents planned for this." He handed me a deed for a small cottage about 20 minutes from the city. "Your grandmother bought it 5 years ago, but kept it in a private trust just for you. Richard has no idea it exists. You have a safe place to go." A huge wave of relief washed over me, knowing I wouldn't be on the street. Still, the idea of hiding out while my family circled like vultures didn't sit right with me. "There is something else," Matthew continued. "You are not fighting this battle on your own. Your grandparents had many loyal friends who knew exactly what your family was like." Right on cue, there was a knock on the back door. Matthew smiled. That would be Carlos. Carlos. The name felt familiar. "Carlos Ramirez," Matthew said. "He was your grandparents' estate manager and handyman for the last 15 years. He manages the caretaker's cottage." The door opened to a man in his late 50s, kind-eyed and graying, holding his cap respectfully. "Miss Chloe," he said gently, "so sorry for your loss. Your grandparents were remarkable people. I saw your car and wanted to check on you." His simple decency almost made me cry again. "Thank you, Frank." "Honestly, I'm just overwhelmed." Frank nodded. "Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Eleanor knew you would be. They asked me to look out for you. The house and grounds are all taken care of. I've been keeping an eye on everything. Mr. Davies waved Frank over to join us. For the next hour, Frank shared stories I'd never heard about my grandparents, painting a picture of 2 people deeply respected by all their staff. "Your father and brother," Frank said, choosing his words with care. "They arrived right after the service, while the house was empty. They took things, cufflinks, jewelry, some new tablets. I have it all on the security cameras. My stomach turned to ice. My father had installed a huge security system for them years ago, he'd said, for their safety. I forgot all about the cameras. Frank shook his head. They didn't know, mister. Arthur had me install a new system last year. He didn't trust the one from your father. Said it had major blind spots. Mister. Davis jotted that down. That footage is crucial if they sue. There's more, Frank said. Mrs. Eleanor kept journals. She documented everything, especially family visits. They're in her study. I followed him to the study where shelves were filled with dated, leather-bound journals. Frank pulled one from the shelf and handed it to me. This one is from when your father asked for money last year, he said, for that big tech investment. I opened it, recognizing my grandmother's graceful handwriting. May 15th. Richard visited today, first time in 7 months. He didn't ask how we were. He launched straight into a pitch for some crypto scheme needing $250,000. When Arthur said no, Richard turned cruel, accusing us of favoring Chloe. He said we were fools to trust her, that she only visited to secure her inheritance. He couldn't be more wrong. Chloe never asks for a penny. She has no idea what we're worth. She brings us pastries from the bakery every Sunday and just stays to chat. Richard stormed out before his tea was cold, leaving Arthur deeply shaken. I kept reading, page after page, year after year of the same story. My father demanding money. My brother with some new absurd startup idea. My mother hinting their modest home was a social embarrassment. But my visits were described with such warmth. My grandmother wrote about the small bouquets I brought, our long conversations, and the little repairs I did around the house. She saw a part of me my own parents refused to see. As I was reading, the doorbell rang. Frank answered, returning with an older woman in a neat floral dress and cardigan. This is Dorothy Reynolds, he said. She was your grandparents' housekeeper for over 20 years. Dorothy wrapped me in a huge hug. You look so much like Eleanor when she was your age, she said, her eyes shining with pride. In the next few hours, more people came. Miss Gable, my grandparent, lead accountant for their bakery chain, offered to walk me through the books. George Patel, their financial planner, brought binders showing exactly how my trust was structured. Sarah Johnson, their neighbor of 30 years, arrived with a lasagna and stories about block parties I attended as a little girl. Every single person brought not just the tata, but genuine warmth. They all adored my grandparents, and because of that, they were now protecting me. While helping me in my grandmother's office, Dorothy found a hidden drawer. It was filled with letters from my father going back decades. Every single one was asking for a loan, some even threatening to keep me from them if they didn't pay up. She also had a USB drive with footage from the day of the funeral. Your mother went through Eleanor's jewelry box before the service ended. She pocketed several pieces, claiming Eleanor would have wanted her to have them. It was obvious my grandparents had been preparing for this fight for years. They hadn't just left me an inheritance, they left me a team and all the proof I'd need. Around 4, while Mr. Davis explained a trust document, my phone buzzed. A text from my brother Leo. Enjoy the house while it lasts. Mom, Dad, and the rest are coming at 10 a.m. tomorrow to claim our share. Stay out of it or it gets ugly. I showed the phone to Mr. Davis. His expression hardened. That's a clear threat, and it sounds like they intend to force their way in, he said softly. I believe it's time to enact the final part of your grandparents' strategy. He made a couple of quick calls, speaking in clipped tones about protocols and evidence. When he hung up, he looked at me, his gaze steady. They knew this would happen, Chloe. They knew Richard and the others would never accept the will, so they prepared for war. Tomorrow morning, we will be ready for them. But tonight, I want you to review all of this so you understand exactly what you are fighting for. He gestured to the dining room table, now covered with journals, bank records, and legal papers. Your grandparents built something far greater than wealth. They built a community based on loyalty and respect. That is their true legacy to you. After everyone except Frank had left for the night, promising to be back in the morning, a strange quiet settled over me. I finally understood that I wasn't facing this alone. My grandparents had passed on not just their estate, but their wisdom and their entire network. I spent the night poring over journals and financial statements, seeing my grandparents in a completely new light. They were shrewd, meticulous, and always a step ahead. Every single move was to protect their legacy, including their heir. For the first time since the reading of the will, I felt I could bear the responsibility they'd given me. I would not let them down. As I was getting ready for bed, a new text from my brother Leo lit up my phone. Sleep with one eye open. Tomorrow you'll learn what happens to thieves in this family. Instead of fear, a cold determination washed over me. Tomorrow would indeed show the consequences of stealing from family. Just not in the way Leo thought. I woke up early, nervous but resolved. By 8 a.m., our lawyer, Mr. Davies, arrived with coffee, croissants, and a heavy binder of legal papers. These are restraining orders, ready to file if needed, he explained, and cease and desist letters for Leo's threats. Our head baker, Marco, arrived right after, going straight to the kitchen. The warm smell of baking scones filled the house. A strange peace before the battle. By 9:30, the house was full of allies. Marco stood by the front door, a silent, imposing presence. Miss Gable, my grandparents' accountant, set up her laptop at the dining table, ready to display the finances. Marco made sure everyone had fresh coffee. His calm presence was a testament to my grandparents' kindness. At 9:45, headlights swept across the lawn as cars began pulling into the long driveway. First, my Uncle Richard's sleek black German sedan, followed by my mother's huge white SUV. Then my Aunt Cynthia and Uncle Mark in their cherry red convertible, a monument to their midlife crisis. Finally, Leo's loud, obnoxious sports car, which he could only afford because his parents paid his bills. "They're early, mister," Davies observed, trying to catch us off guard. The doorbell chimed, sharp and demanding, immediately followed by loud banging. "Mister!" Davies nodded to Marco, who opened the door. My uncle stood there, stunned for a second to see a stranger answer. Behind him, my family was bunched together, their faces a mixture of rage and smug entitlement. "Where's Chloe?" my uncle demanded. "This is a private family matter." Marco stood his ground. "Miss Vance is expecting you. Please, come in." My family filed into the foyer, stopping dead when they saw the crowd assembled in the living room. I stood in the middle of the room with Mr. Davies just behind me and to my right. "What is this?" my mother demanded, her voice tight with anger. "You've brought strangers into a private family issue." Before I could respond, the front door swung open once more, and two more people entered. The first was Judge Catherine Albright, a sharp, imposing woman in her 70s and a dear friend of my grandparents. She was followed by Sarah Jenkins, a local reporter whose college tuition was paid for by my grandparents' foundation. My uncle's face went completely pale at the sight of Judge Albright. The judge had ruled against him in a bitter property dispute years ago, a case my uncle had tried and failed to sway with his social standing. "Catherine," he stammered, forcing in a cheerful tone that fell completely flat. "What on earth brings you here?" The judge's expression was like granite. "I am here at the express written request of Arthur and Eleanor Vance, represented by their souls, Mr. Davies. They asked that I serve as an impartial observer to any family disagreements concerning their estate in the event of their deaths." My mother stared at Sarah Jenkins. "This is absurd. We are here for family heirlooms that belong to us. Why is the press here?" The reporter gave a thin smile. "I'm just friend of the family, not here officially, unless a crime is committed. Then my professional duties would obviously kick in." The threat was not subtle. As if on cue, the back door swung open and 6 more people filed in, forming a protective semicircle behind me. They were the most loyal employees from my grandparents' company, folks who'd known my uncle since he was a boy and watched him grow into a man who was never around. You cannot be serious, Leo scoffed. You think these people are going to scare us? I took a step forward, my confidence bolstered by the people behind me. I know exactly why you're here. You think you're entitled to my grandparents' money, no matter what their will says. You assume you can bully me into giving you whatever you want. My uncle's face went hard. Those old fools were senile. We're just here to fix their obvious mistake. From behind me, Miss Gable's voice cut through. Actually, Richard, we have a record of every time you tried to get your parents' money for the last 20 years. She flipped open a binder, including the unauthorized transfer from their retirement account in 2016, the forged check in 2018, and your attempt to have Eleanor declared incompetent last year after she refused to pay for Leo's little crypto scheme. My uncle's face turned a sickly gray. That's all completely out of context. Marco stepped up next, holding a tablet. I also have the paperwork on the company loan you conveniently never paid back, Richard. $200,000 from 2012 for that ski condo in Aspen. Your parents never came after you for it, but they could have. One by one, my grandparents' oldest friends and employees laid out the proof of my family's attempts to drain them financially, set against the fact they were never there for them in real life. Aunt Cynthia, who had been boiling in silence, finally rounded on me. You ungrateful little witch. You turned them against us with your lies, sis. Judge Albright cleared her throat. In fact, Mrs. Wallace, I've read Eleanor's personal diaries. There was no influence from anyone else. Your parents were very specific about their reasons. This is all very dramatic, my mother said, waving a hand. But it doesn't change a thing. We will contest this will, and we'll win. Miss Davis stepped forward. I've brought some documents for you all. He handed a thick envelope to each of my relatives. It's a file of evidence that becomes public record the moment you contest the will. It includes bank statements, private messages, emails, and video recordings of your interactions with Arthur and Eleanor over the past decade. I would recommend you review it before you make any legal moves. Uncle Mark, who'd been silent this whole time, tore his envelope open and began to read. His face got paler with every line. After a second, he put a hand on my Aunt Cynthia's arm. We need to go, he whispered. This is not a fight we can win. She angrily swatted his hand away. My brother is not a quitter. My uncle, however, was frozen, staring at the papers in his hand. It was a record of some shady business deals he'd tried to bury, along with transcripts of awful things he'd said about his own parents when he thought no one could hear. Sarah Jenkins spoke up. I should also add that the estate is now under 24-hour surveillance. Any attempt to take property without explicit permission will be treated as theft. Marco nodded. The new security system records everything, inside and out, and all the footage is backed up securely in the cloud. While my family was absorbing that, I walked to a small table and grabbed a stack of papers Mr. Davies had ready. These are cease and desist orders for the threats you've been making, I said, handing them right to Leo. I kept handing out papers to my uncle, saying, these are formal notices that I know what you took for this house after the funeral, and I expect it all back. My mother started to protest, but I just talked over her. And these, I said, giving her the last of the documents, are the terms for any future relationship I'm willing to have with you. It starts with you honoring my grandparents' final wishes and ends all attempts to challenge their will. The room was dead silent as my family finally grasped the situation. My grandparents hadn't just legally protected their legacy, they had documented and blocked every single move my family could make. The community they'd built was standing right here with me. My uncle was the first to speak. This isn't over, he blustered, but his voice had no power behind it. Act, Richard, it is, Judge Albright corrected him. Your parents were meticulous. Any court in this state would honor their wishes based on the sheer volume of evidence they collected. One by one, my family started backing toward the door, their threats turning to smoke against a solid wall of facts. Leo shot me a look of pure hatred as he walked by. "This isn't the end," he hissed. "Maybe not," I replied, my voice calm. "But it's the end of you taking advantage of this family. My grandparents saw you for exactly who you are. That's why we're all here." As they retreated to their cars, the tensions in the room finally snapped. Dorothy immediately started pouring coffee and passing around scones, trying to clear the bitter taste from the air. Everyone else was congratulating me, but I just felt empty, trapped somewhere between winning and losing absolutely everything. I did what my grandparents asked, but I had to destroy what was left of my family to do it. The win felt hollow. Judge Miller must have seen the turmoil in my face. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandparents would be so proud, Chloe, not just that you won, but that you handled it all with such dignity." Sophia agreed. "You are more like them than anyone. It says why they trusted you with their legacy." As my family S-cars vanished down the driveway, I knew that part of my life was officially over. The family I knew was gone, replaced by a true community built on respect and shared values. This was the real inheritance my grandparents left me. It wasn't the family I was born into, but I started to think maybe it was the family I was always supposed to have. The next 6 months were a blur of learning, rebuilding, and grieving. The first few weeks were a brutal mix of legal paperwork, financial planning, and the sharp-shot sting of knowing my family chose money over me. They tried to get in touch, but only when they needed something, which proved nothing had changed at all. With Liam and my grandparents' team, I started the Eleanor and Arthur Croft Education Fund, kicking it off with a $10 million endowment for underserved kids and local schools. The foundation focused on art programs and trade skills, things my grandparents believed society often ignored. And I went back to my job as a kindergarten teacher, which seemed to shock everyone who figured I'd just quit after inheriting a fortune. My classroom at Oakwood Elementary became a showcase for what's possible with proper funding. I paid for new books, endless supplies, and the technology our school budget could never afford. Every one of my students got a healthy snack every single day and a new winter coat if they needed one. These were such small gestures for me, but it meant the entire world to them. Under Sophie Martinez's mentorship, I started to learn the ropes of running Croft Industries. I didn't take an executive role, but I made sure the company kept my grandparents' values, like their employee profit-sharing program and incredible retirement benefits. The business flourished, keeping more than 100 people in our town securely employed. My grandparents' home, which had felt so empty, slowly began to feel like my home. I finally moved into the master bedroom, though it took a few months before I didn't feel like an imposter. With help from Marcus, I converted the huge empty basement into a community center for foundation meetings and local workshops. Clara still came to clean 3 times a week, absolutely refusing to retire no matter how many times I told her she had earned a long vacation. My family tried a few more times to get back into my life, and their motives were always painfully obvious. My father called when his latest business venture tanked, asking about a short-term loan. My mother called when she heard about my foundation, suddenly desperate for a seat on the board. My brother Leo sent a text when his startup failed, hoping I'd provide some seed money. Aunt Carol even called before the holidays, suggesting that families should be together, especially in a big, beautiful house perfect for parties. And every single time, I politely but firmly refused, reminding them of the boundaries I set that day in court. I told them I was open to a relationship, but one built on love and respect, not financial need. Not a single one of them could meet those basic conditions. So instead, I created new traditions with the chosen family my grandparents gave me. Sunday dinners were a weekly event at my house, with a rotating cast of guests like Sophia, Liam, Marcus and his kids, Clara and other friends. We celebrated holidays together. We marked achievements, and we showed up for each other. It wasn't the family I was born with, but it was a family held together by real ideals and unconditional love. On a crisp autumn morning, so much like the day that they passed, I visited my grandparents' graves for the first time since the burial. I left fresh lilies and sat on the bench, finally ready for a talk I'd been dreading. "I'm trying to protect what you built," I said to the quiet air. "The family trust is already at work. We funded 3 medical school scholarships for local kids who'd never have had that shot. Your old colleagues still tell stories about your deals. A soft wind blew through the trees and golden leaves danced down around me. It was the exact kind of fall day my grandpa cherished. The perfect weather for hot cider and a good book. I wish you could see this," I continued. "I still have so many questions about the business, about all the people you helped. But I'm learning. In the last few months, I found that old leather-bound journal. It detailed all the anonymous giving you did. Down payments for young families, rent covered for struggling tenants, seed money for small businesses in the neighborhoods you developed. All of it was done in secret, with no expectation of praise. Thank you for having faith in me," I whispered. "I finally understand. It was never really about the fortune. It was about a code using your success to build communities, not just to hoard influence or get your name on a building." Sitting there, the memories flooded back, but the sharp pain of loss was replaced by a deep gratitude. I remembered Grandpa showing me blueprints, explaining the soul of a neighborhood. I remembered Grandma teaching me about color theory for my art projects. They were at every one of my gallery shows when my own parents were always traveling. The real inheritance wasn't the portfolio. It was their vision, their integrity, and the idea that money could be a force for good. The following day, I held the Trust's first major event, a grand ceremony for 10 local entrepreneurs launching their first small businesses. Watching these brilliant, driven people get the capital that could make their dreams a reality, I felt my grandparents right there with me. One of the awardees was a young woman named Maya Singh. She reminded me so much of myself years ago, full of ambition but short on resources. She was starting a coding bootcamp for underserved kids. After the event, Maya approached me, her eyes bright with emotion. "My parents immigrated here with nothing," she said. "They worked in kitchens to give me a chance. No one in our family has ever owned a business. This grant changes everything for us. My cousins now believe they can build something too." In that instant, I saw it clearly. I understood what my grandparents had really built. It wasn't an empire of properties, but a legacy of opportunity, creating waves of positive change that would last for generations. They trusted me to be the caretaker of that legacy. The inheritance had definitely shown me who my real friends were. But it also illuminated a network of genuine relationships, people who respected my grandparents' character, not their net worth. That was the true inheritance, more valuable than any bank statement. So I carry on. I still take on design clients. I manage the trust, and I'm learning the family business. The money is a powerful tool for good, but it doesn't define me. I still live simply, drive an old car, and spend weekends mentoring young artists, not on spending sprees. I think they would be proud. They always said money is a tool, not the prize. And now I finally understand. What about you? Have you dealt with family drama over an inheritance? Or had to stand up for your values? I'd love to read your stories in the comments. If this story resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you liked, subscribed, and maybe shared it with someone who needs a little push to do the right thing. Always remember, real families is about love and support, not about what you're owed or what you can take. Thanks for letting me share my story with you. I hope it gives you the courage to follow your own compass, whatever life throws at you.